Hello, and welcome to Centering Black Girlhood Perspectives from Foster Care. Before I introduce our wonderful presenters today, we do have just a couple of brief things to touch on here, a couple of housekeeping items. So just quickly, my name is Kendall Arthur. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a training and capacity building manager for Youth Collaboratory. Youth Collaboratory has a cooperative agreement with the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention to provide training and technical assistance to project sites with the Supporting Vulnerable Youth Transitioning Out of Foster Care project. So this project was funded by the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, and the opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this program are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect those of the Department of Justice. Couple of housekeeping announcements. Please make sure that your notifications are muted. We hope that you are fully present with us today. We're really excited to present this information to you. Please make sure you are muted unless you are actively engaged in speaking. And please feel free to utilize the chat and drop questions in the chat. There will be discussion time and a Q&A portion, but we definitely want to make sure that we're getting to your questions as they come up. So please feel free to drop those questions in the chat, and I will monitor the chat and feed those questions to Regina and Martine. There will also periodically be links and resources shared in the chat. So if you're looking for something, please check there. Next slide. Youth Collaboratory is a national network that strives to dismantle the systems of oppression that create barriers for young people to achieve liberation and reach their full potential. To transform historically oppressive systems, we work across intersecting issue areas, including youth housing, liberation from exploitation and trafficking, and building supportive relationships and communities through mentoring. Part of this work brings us into partnership with OJJDP in their Supporting Youth Transitioning Out of Foster Care project. You can find more details about this project and our team's work at our website, which I will drop in the chat momentarily. Next slide, please. Now let's meet our speakers today. Regina Dix is a training and capacity building manager at Youth Collaboratory. Regina has over 15 years of experience supporting youth and young adults with dual systems experiences. She believes that representation matters and strives to bridge the gaps of access and equity across systems that impact marginalized youth. Martine Jones is a training and capacity building associate at Youth Collaboratory. Martine utilizes her lived expertise of aging out of the system to chart a more equitable path and possibilities for youth impacted by systems. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Martine.
Thank you so much, Kendall, for those warm introductions. Hi, everyone. I would like to start us off with a land acknowledgement. Land acknowledgements honor Indigenous peoples' stewardships of the lands and promote awareness of their presence and rights and foster respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities. This is also our way of combating the erasure. In the chat, Kendall is going to drop a link, nativeland.ca, where you all can acknowledge the land that you are on. I'm on Tavanga and Chumash people's land, also known as Los Angeles, California. I would love to see where y'all are from and what land you all are on. Furthermore, I would like to move on to the next slide, where we're discussing a little bit more about the labor acknowledgement. I believe, we expand our land acknowledgement to include the recognition that much of our economic progress and development has resulted from the unpaid forced labor of people of color. And we want to encourage organizations to visit both links shared in the chat. So Kendall's also going to link the labor acknowledgement shared in the chat to find out what native land you're currently residing on, as well considering implementing any of all common ground lands and labor acknowledgement statements as best practice in the recognition of exploited labor of those from past, present, and the overrepresentative of Black and Brown bodies within institutions that have been deeply impacted by generational progress. Thank you all for your participation. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Regina.
Thank you, Martine, and we can transition to the next slide. Thank you. And thank you for that very warm introduction, Kendall and Martine, for the land and labor acknowledgement. And thank you all for being here today. I don't know about y'all, but I am excited just to be in space and community with you all. I'm going to go over the agenda, but before we even do that and get into some of that level setting, I just need to for me to woosah and feel comfortable. I just want to be in spaces that feel comfortable and like home. And I hope that Martine and I can also create that sense of warmness for you all, and it can just be a connected thing for all of us that are in this space today. With that level setting, and as Kendall said about my personal introduction and um, especially with the representation part, that does matter, right? And for me, just coming into this space and just recognizing that this work that we all do, but for me personally, this work that I does reminds me that I'm allowed to be while I'm also becoming. And so, as I'm thinking about how representation matters for me, I'm wondering for you all, like, how are you all coming into this space, and what are we representing for ourselves? We're going to definitely be utilizing the chat a lot today. So, as y'all are dropping your names and your organizations and positions and localities, go ahead and use the reaction feature like the emojis, and just represent put it in the chat an emoji that is representing how you're coming into this space today. Um, and while we're doing that, I want to set a tone for us um, to lean into that intergenerational learning. Um, and knowing that this is a space where intergenerational knowledge sharing and learning can exist, and the beauty that comes with that. We all come from different backgrounds, thought patterns, and we're bringing some of that intergenerational knowledge with us through our ancestries and just our own experiences too, right? So there may be some youth and young adults on this call. There may be some folks that are, older, but wisdom does not have an age, right? And so I want us to continue to lean into that as we get into some of the content for today. And lastly, I do want to name that, yeah, we're going to get into the history, right? Because we have to talk about the history. And the elephant in the room is this topic can be a little, a little touchy, a little tough topic to talk about. But with learning the history and bringing into some of that intergenerational knowledge and learning sharing, we can also talk about how that can be nurturing environments for specifically for Black girls, but then also for all of the youth and young adults that we touch across the system. There'll definitely be some opportunities for learning and some new terms maybe that you haven't heard of, or visiting some terms that you may have, and doing a deeper dive in some group discussion and closing reflections, resource sharing, and then definitely questions and answers. We want you to utilize the chat. Certainly, we do have folks that are here that will be able to answer questions in the chat. We'll be recording your questions as well if we don't have time to get to them. But certainly, please take care of yourself, and whatever that means that you need to do for you. If you need to take a break, take a beat, go off camera, please do that. And trust that we honor that, and we will not be offended. Okay, I'm going to transfer it now to Martine to do a little deeper dive in some level setting.
Thank you so much, Regina, for setting the tone. Um, Now, when it comes to level setting, I want us to level set not only intellectually, but I want us to level set emotionally. I want us to do a practice together, and you can do this off camera or on camera, however you're comfortable. So we're going to begin by inhaling with I do what I can, and exhaling with what power I have. So, this is going to allow us, as we are funneling through and dissecting and discussing these imperative conversations, we're also understanding positionality, and everyone's positionality will look different, but that's nor here nor there. It's just about focusing on what you can do and not so much what others can do, but what can you do? What are you bringing to the table? So we're going to start off, but with I do what I can with what power I have. And if this practice helps at all, you can always come back to this throughout if you get overwhelmed. Because I know sometimes I'm like, I'm not doing enough and I wanted to do this, but this happened. And this is just going to let us really level set with, hey, this is what I'm doing. We're staying present. And I hope it brings a little bit of comfort to y'all. Going into the next slide, I want to get into intellectually. Let's get into these learning objectives. So we are going to name the interrelatedness of slavery, systemic racism, cultural bias, and the foster care system. We're also going to be exploring the ecological systems theory through examining healthy ecology systems and its intersectionality to Black girls in the foster care system. We're also going to be understanding the unique challenges that Black girls face in the foster care system at disproportionate rates, including disparities when it comes to overrepresentation, access to equitable resources, and placement instability, and dual systems involvements. We're also going to be examining strategies and best practices for supporting and informing Black girls in foster care. So once again, bringing us back to what can I do? What have I been doing? Just really understanding what power do we have as a collective. Now on to another aspect. Let's talk about some shared agreements. So some of these are very like to me kind of bare minimum. And if you guys have any shared agreements that you want to put in the chat, you can. But these are the ones that we're like non-negotiable. So we got stories stay, lessons leave, call in rather than call out. We're not calling out anyone. Like I said, we already are level setting. Take care of yourself. Make sure that with this information, with this participation, you are self-monitoring yourself, self-monitoring, sorry. Acknowledge that oppression and racism are real and present. We are taking space, but as well making space for others. And we're coming into this space of positive assumptions. So please do not assume that I know how to pronounce every word. I'm just kidding. But no, I'm joking. But yeah, we are making positive assumptions about each other. And everyone brings something to the table, even if it's just an appetite. So as you're setting your own intentions about coming into the space, you don't have to feel like you have to participate. Your participation might look different from everyone else's. And so building on to that idea, let's go into a little bit more of the definitions that we're going to be talking about as we're level setting intellectually. So these might come off as refreshers, reminders, or they might just be new concepts. The first one I wanted to start off with the ecological systems theory. This theory is about it's a framework that views a child development as a complex system of relationships affected by multiple levels. And we're going to go through all those layers and levels that surround the environment. So, from family to social services to school settings to broad cultural values, laws, and customs. We also are going to be discussing adultification. Adultification is when children, particularly minority children, are seen and treated as more mature or adult than what they really are. And this looks different in every community. It's not going to be like there's only one way to see adultification. I know a lot of the times in other school settings, it can look like someone judging. In this situation, we are discussing Black girls. It's like someone saying, oh, that Black girl just seemed um, more mature than other people. And then even within the Black community, we do it to Black girls all the time. We say that girl's fast. And all these are making the child seem more older, more mature than what they actually are. We have a few more. So shifting um, the slide a little bit, let's talk about neurodiversity. Neurodiversity is the ranges of difference is in the individual's brains that function in behavioral traits. So regarded as part of the normal variation in the human population. So it can look like autism, ADHD, ADD, dyslexia, and then we're going to get into the majoritarian narrative. So, this is going to be discussing how the dominant or prevailing viewpoint, perspective, or ideology that is held by majority of the particular group or society. And this excludes this mindset excludes and dismisses minority perspectives and voices. So thank y'all for staying with me for this level setting. I'm now going to pass it back to my colleague, Regina.
Thank you, Martine, for taking us through that walk of level setting, which is very important. Um, and so as we transition to this quote, I think this is a beautiful quote by Maya Angelou. The more you know of your history, the more liberated you are. Um, just let that resonate on your spirit a little bit. And while you're letting that resonate, I just wanted to piggyback just a bit off of what you were saying about adultification, because I also found a beautiful quote by Monique Morris that kind of talks about that a little bit. Um, and so thinking about like for Black girls, to be ghetto represents a certain resilience of how poverty has shaped racial and gender oppression. To be loud is to be deemed to be heard, demanded to be heard. To have an attitude is to reject the doctrine of invisibility and maltreatment. To be flamboyant or fabulous is to reverse the idea that socioeconomic isolation is equated with not having access to material, desirable things. To be a ghetto Black girl, then, is to reinvent what it means to be Black, poor, and female. So that just hit me deeply. And I just wanted to share that in this space, especially before we get into this next component where we'll share a video. And this is kind of just doing a deeper dive into the history of just thinking through how we kind of got to where we are today, and how history is very important because it shapes the narrative of where we are, and also how we come as a collective for future changing and shifting what that difference can look like. And so I will pause for us to watch the video, and then we'll do a deeper dive into some of that historical component, as well as some of those impacts that historical trauma has had on Black families in foster care.
The racist roots of the child welfare system. Forcible separation of black families has deep roots in American slavery, which commodified and exploited enslaved black women's reproductive capacity as fuel for economic growth. This system depended on denying enslaved mothers custody of their children, who were considered property of the slaveholder. When the government assumed responsibility for quote-unquote child welfare in the early 20th century, its intervention in indigenous communities was so extensive that by the 1970s, up to 2/3 of indigenous children no longer lived with their families or in their own communities. In the 1960s, black families were blamed for raising children in poverty and punished with permanent termination of their parental rights. This is the framework in which the child welfare system, better understood as the family regulation system, continues to operate today. Black families in New York are 7 times as likely as white families to be reported to the family regulation system and 13 times more likely to have their children removed. State lawmakers must act swiftly to reduce the number of black and brown families needlessly investigated, torn apart, and traumatized by this racist system.
So, and watching that and just kind of doing, a deeper dive in how the that's truly been like a trajectory to direct impacts on historical trauma on Black families. And then thinking through these three kind of key factors, understanding how that interconnectedness between slavery and foster care system has separated families, especially with the overrepresentation of Black bodies in the foster care system, and recognizing that systemic racism and where that comes in plays a factor. And racial disparities in housing as well. Thinking through like historical events that have been impactful for it's especially like redlining and how that's forced families into segregated neighborhoods with fewer resources, also increasing poverty and that representation in the child welfare systems. And intergenerational trauma. We talked about intergenerational knowledge sharing, but that trauma piece is a huge part of our history, right? And understanding our history is a huge component of where we're going. We can't understand where we're going until we address and recognize where we've been. And so there is a few different resources that I'd like to kind of drop into the chat that just talk a little bit more about that experience and how um, it really truly affects young girls um, who are overrepresented. Oop. I'm going to in just a second, I will update that link. I don't think that it's linking, but I'll update those resources links in just a bit. And we have a portion of time for sharing resources, but these resources that we're going to be sharing just also speaks to some of the things that were noted in the video, but then also throughout the presentation that we'll be talking about today. Okay, and so I want us to think through as we go to the next slide about power and influence. And that's one of the things that I really like to lean into, because we all, no matter where our positionality is, right? We all have some level of power and influence. And so in thinking about that, what is our cultural responsiveness to that racial trauma piece? And understanding how racial trauma is, and racial trauma, understanding how cultural responsiveness relates to racial trauma and why it matters as youth service providers, and also what we can do about it, right? Um, and so it's thinking through cultural responsiveness is the ability to listen and learn and reflect on one's culture, the culture of others, and how that may interact during um, interpersonal interactions. But by being cultural responsive, you increase awareness of your own biases and privileges, in which we can foster and promote respect, curiosity, learning, and experiences of belonging. Um, and so I wonder if, even for myself, when I think about that, and as it relates to racial trauma, right? Like, where are we coming in? Where do you? We'll take it back to you. Where do you come in at with your level of power, your level of influence as it relates to that cultural responsiveness? And how can we lean in to that more when interacting with each other, or when interacting with the young people that we serve? And doing a deeper dive on the next slide, thinking about cultural responsiveness and to racial trauma and why does it matter? Um, it really, really is an element that lies in like trauma intervention, lies in cultural responsiveness, like in how we intervene in that is really understanding that, oh, I'm sorry, my dog is barking and it's but thinking through the effects of racism, past and present, continue to play out today. How we understand racial trauma and the accounts for social, cultural, and historical context is huge. It's intervene in overcoming taboos, such as naming racism, right? Just saying the thing, making the unspeakable unspeakable. And acknowledging the past experience of trauma enables opportunities for healing and visible wounds. So that acknowledgement piece is huge. You know, sometimes it's hard, like how we said earlier, that we're just going to talk about some hard stuff, right? And that we need to just be able to set a tone and create a space where we get comfortable with uncomfortable conversations and, you know, get cozy and settle in. Um, and so I would be remiss to name that, you know, the elephant in the room, but also that this is a topic that is important, and thinking through like that awareness piece and how we respond to the awareness and our positionality is significant to improving also like mental health outcomes for youth and young adults. As service providers, what is it that we can do? With that power and influence, we also have great responsibility too, right? And as individuals and a collective body within our organizations and communities, and even nationally, um, to address and impact those experiences of young people, like I want you to think about as we continue on today, like where is your positionality within all of that? And thinking about like where does your power and influence lie when it comes to even just this cultural responsiveness, and why is it important to you? Okay. So we'll go to the next section, and I'm going to pass it on to Martine to talk about the nurturing environments versus the neglectful systems.
Thank you so much, Regina. So as we're shifting gears, we're going to be examining the two focus areas of the ecological theory. Next slide, please. This is a depiction of the ecological dynamics, which are the layers of influence. So utilizing the black girl and the black girl in foster care experience, we're going to refer to this refer to these layers. So starting with the first one, the chrono system. The chrono system refers to the changes over time that impact the development of Black girls in foster care. So this is the changes in the family structure. Um, for example, Black girls may experience disruptions and changes in family structure due to entering foster care, which can influence like their development and well-being over time. And this is a common experience amongst the most like the vast foster care experience. However, looking at a closer lens, let's discuss how these disruptions have been at the hands of systemic violence as well as microaggressions. Next, we're going to hit into the macro system. And this encompasses like a broader societal and cultural values that affect Black girls. So let's look at the social and cultural values. Black girls are influenced by societal attitudes, belief, norms related to race, gender, foster care, and these values can shape their experiences and opportunities within the foster care system. While we're going to get into deeper conversations about this, I want your brain to just kind of start thinking like, hey, like what can these look like? Going into the exosystem. So the exosystem, this includes like indirect environments that indirectly impact um, the Black girls in foster care. So it's like this can look like the parents' workplace, the neighbors, the extended family members. This environment's like a foster parents and the foster parents' neighborhoods, extended family members. This can influence the support and resources available to Black girls in foster care. So a lot of the times, if they're not working together, they're working against each other. And those are manifesting more chaos, more disruption. Moving into the mesosystem, This involves connections and interactions between different microsystems in the lives of Black girls in foster care. So let's talk about like what are those interconnections? Those what are those interactions? What kind of interactions are those? So that's like the relationships with their immediate environments, like the family, school, and peers, and how those are influenced by the connections with these microsystems. So, for example, like how the experiences in school impact in interactions within the foster care family. And I know as organizations providing services, sometimes it's like how are opportunities you're trying to bring to these to youth you're working with, how are those being interacted with at home, like therapy. We want to have more therapy services, but the family is resistant. The family is reluctant. So how are those interacting? And then we're going to move back into the microsystem. So the microsystem, this is all of the immediate environments, how they directly impact Black girls in foster care. And so once again, we're talking about school, family, peers, and how Black girls interact directly with their immediate environments every day. And these play a crucial role in shaping the development experiences within the foster care system almost immediately. So understanding these ecological systems provides a holistic view of all the factors and the context that influence the development and experiences in Black girls and foster care, and it heightens the importance of considering various levels of the broader societal values to immediate interpersonal relationships. And and the biggest piece I want you guys to take away from is this is the science behind the common saying, "Let's meet youth where we're at. Let's meet them where you're at." Well, do you really know where they're at? Let's take a greater lens and understand where are they at. What is the science behind where they're at? How are we going to meet them where we're at? Or we really don't understand. We might, okay, well, they don't want to be they're refusing this service, like we can take it as face value, or you can look into, well, what's making them resist. Let's look a little bit more deeper. What are the connections, what are the relationships that they're faced with? And moving on to the next slide, I'm going to pass this along to Regina.
Thank you, Martine. Um, okay, and so we're gonna do a deeper dive into learning more about like the nurturing environments and neglectful systems of Black girls, ecology, and foster care. And so we'll do a deeper dive in exploring the contrasting of these ecologies, so that it can highlight a better critical factors that contribute to positive and negative outcomes for Black girls in foster care. This framework, and within this framework, and this examination of the negative and positive ecologies to the experiences of Black girls in the foster care, this will be able to measure the comparisons of how these factors contribute to the different outcomes of them, and then explore uh, some positive opportunities that we can think through for how those outcomes can be more effective and positive, and truly like meeting them where they're at. Kind of like what Martine said, just do you know where they're at? And so how can some of those outcomes be more individualized for real results and outcomes on that individual level? So Martine's going to start us out by looking into the neglectful ecology.
Thank you, Regina. So, turning our attention to a neglectful ecology. So, within a neglectful ecology, for Black girls, like this is referencing to the environment, the societal context that fails to appropriately support and nurture their well-being, their development, and sense of self-worth. And this can manifest in various ways, but the ways that we're going to focus on today are adultification, exacerbated vulnerability to commercial sexual exploitation, and behavioral and neurodivergent dismissal. Next slide, we're going to explore into the adultification. So we already had kind of like the introduction of adultification, but I want to talk about how adultification can be so harmful when it comes to Black girls in foster care. So we'll start off with the higher expectations of maturity. Social services professionals may show less patience and understanding towards Black girls when they shift their when they exhibit behavior that's typical of their age group, such as emotional outbursts or defiance. This lack of empathy can result in quicker judgments and punitive actions. Like Black girls are more independent and self efficient, so overlooking their need for guidance, their support, and nurturing. And like full disclosure, I am a former foster youth, and so many times um, some of my initiatives, some of my intentionality, whether it's socially or academically, were looked at. Oh, like you're disruptive, or oh, you are. You're not you're moving too fast for the group, like you're not being patient with others, instead of looking at, oh, that could be a leader. You like looking at some of having a bias when it comes to some of these interactions. It's like people, like, I know a lot of conversation is like, never worry about the first child, like you were the child we didn't have to worry about, it was the second one. And it's like, no, you should worry about every child, you know what I mean? And they all have their unique challenges and differences. So it's just putting on that higher expectation of, oh, I already know how you're going to react, and whether it's negative or whether it's, oh, we don't have to have as much um, consideration when it comes to you. And this assumption is very dangerous. Then moving on to the diminishing of the childhood. So adultification can rob Black girls of their childhood and placing premature responsibilities and burdens on them. And they may be expected to navigate complex systems and advocate for themselves without adequate support. And lastly, discussed this a little bit earlier with the higher expectations, but the risk of harsher punishment. So, adultification can lead to harsher punishment disciplinary measurements for Black girls, including disproportionate consequences for minor infractions compared to their non Black counterparts in foster care. And we're going to get into some of the statistics of these. But once again, a very, very dangerous approach to disciplinary. It's like, oh, well, you're older, you should have known better. Like, you don't have any, we're not showing any grace. Building on this idea, we're going to go in the next slide to consider how far can equality go in the foster care system. So fair is not always equal in the foster care system. Looking into some of these statistics, we can look, and then I also like you to keep in mind the video we watch regarding the relationship with the child welfare has with slavery. So keeping in what that means is I want you guys to keep in mind the historical context of over policing on Black bodies. How have we shifted from these roots? How have we shifted from the blueprint? I'm going to tell you, not very far. As you look at the statistics outlines here, these statistics are a testament of the experiences that Black girls and even and just youth of color have um, systematically. Over 50% of Black children in the US will experience a child welfare investigation before their 18th birthday. This is nearly double the rate of white children. Nearly 10% of Black children will be removed from their parents and placed into foster care, double the rate of white children. 1 in 41 Black children will have their relationship with their birth parent or parents legally terminated. This is more than double the rate of the general population. 3% of Black youth who age out of foster care experience homelessness, and 29% experience incarceration, far higher rates for non Black youth. In 2020, over 70% of all children and 63% of Black children were moved in the US foster care system or taken away from their families for reasons related to neglect. Now, when we talk about neglect and we talk about the removal, we have to keep in mind how are these families, how have they been equipped to begin with? And going back as well to the layers of the influences of the child, what have these families that are rejected with therapy, what has their experience look like? Because that's our direct that's the first experience, some of the first experiences that this child is going to have that we're trying to serve. So we have to understand how it's affecting the family. What have they been equipped? What have we been equipped with when it comes to their knowledge of getting support, getting things, getting having stability. Moving on to a little bit more of the statistics, but more about equity. Into the next slide, we have this curriculum of how, like, the system of foster care, how it starts and the outcomes. And within this chart, I want you guys to keep in mind that equity is more beneficial to Black girls in foster care than equality, because it's going to acknowledge and address the systemic barriers and historical injustice that they face in systems. In the system of foster care, where a child's journey begins with abuse, neglect, abandonment, equity is going to recognize that Black girls can often start from a disadvantaged position due to factors like systemic racism, intergenerational trauma, and socioeconomic disparities. Thank you. Now we're going to shift the conversation a little bit more and head into understanding the intersection of Black girls in foster care and the commercial exploitation. There's various factors, and we're going to focus on these four. So, increased vulnerability. Black girls in foster care we are disproportionately vulnerable to exploitation due to unstable living situations, limited support networks, and histories of trauma and abuse. This is this helps us be more targeted for traffickers that are seeking profit. We're going to go into how the lack of support for Black girls in foster care can this inadequate support can lead to lack of supervision, support from caregivers, services providers, allowing exploitation opportunities to go unnoticed. A lot of the time, these punitive measures, when it comes to disciplinary, they're isolating. So, like, either whether you're disciplining them because they did something wrong, are you helping them if you're not supervising them, if you're not still showing up for them, if you're not yeah, if you're not showing up for them, you're leaving them to themselves, you're isolating them. Then we're going to go into the intersection of racism. So when it comes to racism and sexism, the intersectionality, the duality, is just like the double-edged sword. And this is very similar to being queer and Black. So being a woman and being a Black, you have to navigate the sexualization and as well as adultification because of your skin color and as well as because you're gendered. Then moving on to barriers and reporting. So Black girls in foster care, they face the barriers of retaliation or lack of trust in authorities. So when it comes to reporting, these numbers sometimes are very much skewed by the hindrance of their ability to report exploitation and access support. And then going back into a little bit more about the racism, um, the intercounting, the intersectioning of racism and sexism within the foster care system also just like contributes. I want to make make it clear it's also contributing to the juvenile justice system as well. Moving on to moving on to the next slide, I want to give us some practices to address these intersections. Um, I want to kind of start off by like strengthening the supporting systems within the foster care system to provide stable and nurturing environments. And this can look like tailored support systems. So providing individualized support such as behavioral therapy, academic accommodations to meet um, specific needs regarding like disciplinary actions, implementing trauma informed care practices. This can look like more enhancement and collaboration between agencies, building relationships with law enforcement and community organizations to identify and respond to these exploitation cases. And as well as just empowering Black girls with their education and their resources and opportunities to help reduce vulnerability and promote resilience. So it's not talking about like let's overly there's a difference between over policing, over surveillance, and then just providing more resources, more support, showing up, leaving that porch light on, like just being there. Those are two different those are two different approaches, and I want to make sure they don't get mixed up. Moving on to the neurodivergent neglect. So shifting gears, I want us to start examining um, the lasting impacts of neglect regarding neurodiversity. Thank you. So the lacking impacts of neglect when it comes to neurodiversity can look like the lack of appropriate support and interventions that are tailored to the specific needs of Black girls. This can result in more punishment. This can also lead to like any like struggling with social interactions, building those relationships. I'm sure some of these phrases of permanent connections, those are like that's something we always want to build, especially with foster youth, is building those permanent connections, building those relationships they can
Wait,
rely on. Hello? I'm sorry. I thought I heard something. I'm so sorry. I thought someone said something. Um, However, like, sorry, that kinda knocked me off, I thought I heard something. But, so, like, we talk about permanent connections, like, building those connections. Well, how can we build those connections if we don't feel like this is a safe place to build those connections? Like, we don't feel like our interactions are visible, or the emotional regulations, are harder to monitor and cope with because we don't have the practices or the support to help them. So these can all contribute to like lasting impacts, and also they can contribute to heightened levels of anxiety, depression, and low self-esteem, because once again we're moving back into like isolation. And then I want to move into the next slide and put y'all on to some intervention strategies. So, how can we mitigate the impact of neurodivergent neglect and ensure that Black girls in foster care can receive necessary support, understanding, and opportunities to thrive? We have listed here tailored support services. So, making sure that we're going that extra mile if need be to provide individualized support services that are based on neurodivergent needs, including behavioral therapy, speech therapy, academic accommodations. I know, just like I said, full transparency with you guys. I have a learning disability, so like it took me until being in college to realize that. And then once I started getting longer time on my test, I was like, "Oh my god, C's don't get degrees. I can be on the dean's list." So, definitely those help so much. And then advocacy and empowerment. Once again, like empowering neurodivergent Black girls to advocate for their needs, their preferences, providing that autonomy, like letting someone know that I just know I think this is a shared experience amongst most foster youth of just not feeling so limited, feeling like you need to get in where you fit in, and not feeling like, okay, you can advocate for these needs. It doesn't make you difficult. It doesn't make things harder. Um, so just fostering the self advocacy and autonomy, and then also like the collaborative partnerships that we mentioned earlier. So like moving between agencies, schools, mental health providers, depending on the community to help create a comprehensive support network for neurodivergent Black girls. And so I'm going to pass this over to my colleague Regina to give us a little bit more information about the nurturing ecosystem for Black girls in foster care.
yes, thank you, Martine, and thank you for sharing all of that those resources, and just um, sharing about that background of some of the negative aspects, and then resources of how we can shift. And so now I'm going to get into more equitable approaches to centering nurturing ecosystems for Black girls in foster care. And so what does and thinking through like what those systems can look like or do look like, and knowing that there's not a one-stop shop, right? There's no cookie cutter sort of kind of grab bag situation here when it comes to nurturing ecosystems. It's truly individualized and by the individual, but it's supportive and it's inclusive environments that nurtures the physical, emotional, and cultural well-being. And so how is culture coming in as a protective factor, considering all of those different statistics that Martine shared before, because those statistics are coming in, right? Like those statistics represent individual real stories, and how that over-representation exists in the system, in our communities, in our programs, in the systems that we work in and we exist in every day. So cultural affirmations and inclusivity. Foster care systems should prioritize cultural sensitivity and inclusivity to create an environment where Black girls feel respected, valued, and understood. This includes acknowledging and celebrating their cultural heritage, traditions, and experiences. I remember when I worked at a youth service at a youth home, one of the things that I really was excited about is is for birthdays. And so it was a way to celebrate different young people's birthdays, and just ask them like, what do you want for your birthday? Or what is one thing that you've always thought about, like that you wanted, or does that represents like home, or what represents for you that feels good. And just taking it to that individual approach made all of the world of a difference. And then the cultural piece too, right? And so affirming and recognizing where a person's cultural background, and where they've come from, and not like that erasure, is huge to include. And it directly ties into emotional and psychological safety. It's paramount for those supports of development and emotional regulation skills, allowing Black girls to identify, express, and manage their feelings. And thinking about some of that like adultification piece that Martine mentioned earlier about how sometimes Black girls can be represented in spaces of being labeled, of things that labels that were kind of given to them, passed down to them, that don't represent who they are at all. And I've had that for myself, even as a Black woman, or even just as my lived experience of, we all know like different coins of, biases and stereotypes that have been subscribed to our culture and our heritage that we don't subscribe to. So being angry, right? Or yelling, or being over sexualized and things like that. Those all are things that are exactly the exact opposite of things that deeply affect our emotional and psychological safety when we as a society subscribe to those narratives. But the numbers and statistics tell us that we do. So it's unlearning some of those things, right? And then our community engagement is huge. It's huge. How can we deep dive into community engagement, tie those young people back into the communities that maybe they were once in and maybe are not in anymore? It empowers Black girls in foster care by providing them with the opportunities to connect, learn, and grow within supportive and culturally affirming environments. By prioritizing community partnerships and involvement, caregivers and professionals can enhance the overall quality of care and outcomes for Black girls in foster care. And when we get into this next slide in this next section, we're really going to do a deeper dive on equitable approaches to address cultural needs, but we're really going to hone in on the cultural needs around the hair care piece, right? Because that is huge. That is a huge component. And I remember even when working in a youth service provider home, like you all know sometimes how like those little hotel samples or the little small little bottles somehow end up to be in your resources, your hygiene kits, right? um and free is not always better. Like, how are we making sure that our budgets reflect the needs, our cultural needs of the young people that we are serving? While yes, the little hotel conditioner and shampoo does work, it's good to have on hand. That cannot be the only products that we carry, right? And so how is that even reflective in the way that our nonverbals? Because not even speaking or not even saying anything, when you don't take those things, those equitable approaches into account, and you might be meeting a young person of color for the first time coming into your program, or whatever it is, however you're meeting them, and you greet them with hygiene products that do not represent them. What is that saying without saying? So let that resonate a little bit as we continue to go through here. So cultural respect and identity, it's definitely not giving respect, right? Without even saying that I respect you, I respect your identity. Black hair is deeply tied to cultural identity and heritage, and providing proper hair care for Black girls here at foster care system, it demonstrates respect for their cultural backgrounds and helps them maintain a positive sense of identity. And then that physical health. Neglecting proper hair care can lead to various health issues, including dryness, breakage, scalp conditions, and even hair loss. By ensuring that Black girls receive adequate hair care, foster care systems contributes to their physical health and comfort. And more on that subject, getting into the social inclusion piece, right? Like um, thinking about, all of the things and identities that we all hold and possess as individuals. But for Black girls specifically, or people of color, and when young people are coming into care for the first time, or it's a new placement, social inclusion of where they're coming from or where they've been or the families that they're leaving behind plays a big factor in that. So, and sometimes you think, I know a lot of programs don't allow cell phones, right? But in thinking through, like, how are some different approaches that you can still honor some of the things that they're, the losses that they're mourning, that social inclusion piece that they're coming into now, and still honor the places that and the losses that they may be mourning. And so with the beauty standpoint of it, because it is beyond just hair care, but that is a big component of it too, right? So thinking about like how often our beauty is really rooted in a Eurocentric kind of lens. Um, and by teaching proper hair care techniques, and having adequate people, or tapping into beauty salons and barbershops, and creating relationships with those folks, that is social inclusion. And empowerment and autonomy. That's giving young people autonomy over their bodies, over their hair, having a budget of and allowing a young person to go back into the communities that they know, the hairdressers and barbers that they know, and being able to continue to allow them to have the upkeep of their hair from places and spaces that are familiar to them is equitable approaches. And then the education piece. How are we making sure that that is an important piece of our curriculums? And building into some of those MOUs to have opportunities for I'm losing my words, for partnerships and connectedness. Thank you. So thinking through that, and how educating foster families, educating service providers is huge for that continued growth and just nurturing of Black hair. And accessibility is necessary to products. We talked about that a little bit, but yes, that is very important to have that accessibility and to have that in your budget. And so I know budgets are tight. Like, come on, let's keep it real. Yes, yes, budgets are tight. But having this as an important piece to your programs is huge. And so how can those be things that are prioritized in fundraising? And advertising that, or where's young people coming into the picture?
Hi. Hello. It's Marion. Nice.
Hi. I'm so excited that you're here, Meredith. I think that's what you said your name is. If you don't mind just muting yourself, we're gonna have some time for continued conversations in just a bit. And then also thinking about empowerment. Addressing Black hair care practices for girls in foster care is crucial for their well-being and self-esteem. I know that, we all like hair is big for all of us, but when Black hair is not properly cared for, the damage of the damage and the results of damage is real. It is so real. And walking around without feeling like your best self does directly affect your self-esteem, your mental health, physical health, well-being. So confidence is key. Okay. And then, going into the emotional and psychological safety of that. We talked a little bit about this, but prioritizing emotional wellness of Black girls, and includes addressing discrimination and microaggressions within the foster care system. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation. And that is an act of political warfare. And that is by Andre Lorde. And that is a great quote to think about as we're thinking about the emotional and psychological safety. I also want to these three topics within emotional psychological safety are very big. Advocacy for self-care and mental health support. And then also, I just want to say one other quote. Defining freedom cannot amount to simply substituting it with inclusion. Countering the criminalization of Black girls requires fundamentally altering the relationships between Black girls and institutions of power that have worked to reinforce their subjugation. Sorry. History has taught us that civil rights are but one component of a larger movement for this type of social transformation. Civil rights may be at the core of equal justice movements, and they may elevate an equity agenda that protects our children from racial and gender discrimination, but they do not have the capacity to fully redistribute power, eradicate racial inequity, and there's only one practice that can do that, and that is love. And I leave you with this quote only because thinking about the emotional and psychological safety, especially for Black girls, and how they show up in overrepresentation in the system, and how we show up in this system to support them, that only can be done through acts of love. Okay, and that brings us to my final point about importance of community engagement and involvement. So building those supportive networks. How are we coming in as agencies, social workers, caregivers, change agents, just to be able to enhance the local community to support this population? So building those supports and thinking through, like, what is it that you have as an organization, as a caregiver, that you can utilize to meet another need that another organization may have, where that partnership can be organic, but it can be beneficial for both, right? And mentorship programs. Facilitating those mentorship programs in a targeted outreach aspect is very key. And being specific about that authenticity when you're approaching that, and what your audience is, right? Involving young people. Where are young people at in these in the conversation and the decision-making processes? Having youth voice at the table at every part of the process is very important. It is key. And that community outreach and advocacy part as well. Engaging in community outreach to raise awareness about unique challenges faced by Black girls in foster care, and advocacy for policies and promote equity and support. What policies do we have that we are perpetuating this narrative still, right? How can we shift these policies that we interact with on a daily basis in the programs that we run? And it also brings back that our power and our influence. Where does our power and influence and positionality lie within being able to shape the narrative for some of these resources or practices that we do that we can make some improvements in? Okay, so I feel like Martine and I word vomited so much at you guys, and we apologize, but not really. This has been a really deep, you know, rich conversation, like kind of one-way conversation thus far, but I see y'all in the chat. Continue to engage in the chat. We are going to transition now, though, to our group discussions where we're going to be able to hear from each other because that is important too. So I'm going to let Martine talk us through that portion.
Thank you, Regina. And yes, like I'm really excited for this because yeah, I've been paying attention to the chat and there's so many of you all who have been like telling your opinions and also asking questions. So what we're gonna do is we have 16 minutes to pull this off. So we're gonna have 3 different breakout groups, and Kendall is now in real time listing the different discussion questions in the groups. So in the 3 breakout groups, it's going to be the first one, Regina, and we're going to ask, how does understanding the historical context of systemic racism, particularly the legacy of slavery, contribute to our understanding of disparities within the foster care system for Black girls? And you all will discuss for 10 minutes, and then we're going to come back together for a larger group conversation, and we're going to have one person from the group speak about what we came out with and report that for 6 minutes. So each group is going to have 2 minutes. Each of the 3 groups are going to have 2 minutes to speak out on what answer you came up with to these questions. um, and I'm just really excited to start. So we're gonna head out to the breakout rooms. And as I'm just running my mouth now, I'm yapping. Lakendra, thank you so much for for the research that you have spent on this topic. I think it's a very much like it is a siloed conversation that definitely needs a lot more exposure. So I appreciate the work that you have committed and still committing because you're in this conversation right now. So we're gonna head out in the breakout rooms right now, and I can't wait to discuss more with you all. We just did not have enough time.
We did not. We were just getting to the heat of things in our group. What about you, Martine?
We were definitely getting to the one thing I want to say about my group, we had so many different hand raises that we didn't get to. And it was just very empowering just being in that space of seeing how so many people wanted to share how to work together, because sometimes that's just the start. It's like, who wants to start? So I'm just so grateful that like we even had so much participation, and I just wish we had more time.
Same,
But I
same.
do want to, yeah, I want to start out the sharing. So I want to start off by we had a lovely individual named Tori share, and we all kind of like we had different ideas as well. But Tori really started us off by talking about how these kind of presentations start off conversations, and they're happening all at different times, but it's like it's more about keeping that momentum than like, oh, this should have happened, this should have, like, we already know these conversations are overdue, but it's she really um honed in on how these conversations are going to spark that momentum that we all have to keep going and keep pushing, because and it really did remind me of another Audre Lorde quote of, without community there is no liberation, but community must not mean like shedding our differences, nor like this pretense that these differences do not exist. It's about understanding that we all have differences. We all come into this space, and how are we all going to coexist? How are we all going to come together? So no matter if like we can't, it should not just be all Black women speaking for this or all white people speaking for this. It's about coming together like as a community for specific communities and uplifting them. So that's what that was like. Tori really started us off, and there were so many other different takes on this answer. And we just needed more time. But I'll let you share.
Okay, thank you, Martine. That sounds like some really good discussion going on in your group. And in my group, we had, it was the first question about the historical context of systemic racism, right? And so we had some great discussion in our group where we talked about, one of the folks in our group talked about like how it shows up in like forcible separation and neglect and removal and normalizing and the normalization of accusations from the past, and that's something that's even present to this day. And then even language, how language matters, and thinking about like even the word, the legacy of slavery. Um, and thinking about like legacy and how like when you think of legacy, and what you associate the word legacy with, and it's almost like in past tense. And while some of the things that represent slavery in modern day still are things that we are navigating and facing, navigating as a society and a culture, right? And so how some of that language matters, and thinking through this reflection question. And somebody shared in the group about how in their organization, they had like book studies and just like also like affinity groups or accountability groups and things like that, and just practices that they had in place for that accountability. So like if you're because you're a mandated reporter, if you were going to fill out a 3200 report to report like neglect, abuse, whatever that is, you had almost like an accountability partner to kind of run that by, to make sure that like knowing that like, hey, there is overrepresentation of some white folks in this system, right? And we want to make sure that like, especially if this is a family of color that could result in a removal, that we have that accountability piece with our colleagues and other supportive community folks that would help make sure that those reports are not done in from a biased lens. And so I love the fact that those were practices and policies that were already in place in those organizations. And lastly, there was so much rich stuff, but because of time, there was also conversation around like gynecological health and inequities within gynecological health. There was a great book that was dropped in the chat that Jay Barber dropped in the chat about medical bondage and how that equates with race and gender and the origins of America gynecology, and how that showed up in like that book gave words and language to experiences that they were seeing with families and young people that they were representing, but didn't have the words and proper language for it. Again, language matters, right? So that was a helpful tool in advocating for the things that you don't know what you don't know, but when you know, boy, do you know. I'll stop there because I know that Kendall still has to share and report out.
Yes, thank you. Please don't leave yet, but we are dropping a link to the evaluation. We know we're close on time, but if y'all can stick with us a few more minutes, we would appreciate it. For group 3, We had a two-part question, and we only very briefly touched on the second part of the question. Unfortunately, we also ran out of time. There's been so much information. We need like a part two of this. We talked a lot about one of the best ways to empower and support Black girls in foster care is by listening to them and showing up authentically, and not just listening in like a patronizing way, but in that real, authentic, engaging way. We also talked about educating funders and donors on the importance of different funding sources and unrestricted funding sources that can be spent on proper care needs. And we also, one of the most powerful pieces, I think, was around if you are working with youth of color, especially Black girls, but youth of color in general, you need to be educated on racial issues, on racial justice, on racial disparities, and about Black history is American history. And if you don't know Black history, then you're not able to properly serve the young people that you're serving with, because you can't fully understand that generational trauma.
Thank you so much, Kendall. Like these were just, uh, I keep saying more time. And these answers were just so like directly, like just like a direct testimony of how important these conversations are, because like even within these answers we just keep talking about like the lack and just like these gaps that we have to be filled, and like we are going to be the ones to fill them, and as well as our communities and friends. And I just know the work will get done. It's a heavy lift, but it will get done. So I definitely want to share out some resources with you guys on the next slide, just to make sure that we are um, just sharing as much as possible and providing as much as possible outside of the discourse, for you guys to have some of these resources. I'm sorry, I'm still like in the chat. Um, there was a book that was mentioned, Regina, so if you can definitely. And yes, this recording is going to be sent out. And also, you guys have the slide decks as well that was sent out before. And so yeah, just making sure y'all have that. And we're gonna move to the next slide. We're gonna we have some questions. I also just want to make sure you guys like, we have some questions that were already in the chat that you want to get to, and we're probably not gonna get to all of them. So I just wanted to say again, like I'm so thankful that y'all are even asking questions and just like engaging with this material. I feel very, very passionate about this presentation, and yeah, so I'm just really happy. But I wanted to start off with one of the questions that was said earlier. It was from Morella, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. And you were asking about like how like you're saying it's a struggle to raise awareness to some of these issues that were talked about in this presentation. Um, like how are strategies to like approach this, because you work in a predominantly white staffed school with administrators and school boards. And so like in your experience, this has not been much interest in the students and families of color, like much interest in the families of color. And so how do you bring this up? And I'm so happy that you're asking this, and like this is very much like a call to action question. That's how I'm receiving it. And I think like you really have to um speak about, like, especially like I can only imagine there's a lot of disciplinary measures that go on in your school, especially if these conversations are not being addressed. So you really have to like you have to see. I would just like recommend that you talk about what they see and just add that different narrative, add that different lens. Some of the lenses that we were talking about, some people are seeing these issues, they're seeing the same issues that we're talking about, but they're coming from a different curriculum. They're coming from a different narrative. And so you have to utilize that narrative. You have to utilize a narrative that they're having and shift it. You have to say the same thing that they're saying, but you have to make it into a more equitable approach and say this the same issue that you're seeing, this is what that issue is. This is what you're really talking about. They think they talking about the color green and you gonna tell them you talking about the color pink. That's what you have to do. I think I think that that is very, very helpful when people have like this dissonance and there's not interest and some things feel forced or they feel ignored. I feel like you have to kind of a way to approach that level setting is just be like, okay, you're talking about this is what I'm talking about too, and just trying to shift the narrative. I hope that helped.
We also
Oh yeah,
we al-
Kindle.
We also had a question from Tori. What are the best practices being utilized to stop or decrease the adultification happening?
Thank you so much for that question. And also, Regina, feel free to jump in. I ain't trying to be the feel free to jump in, Regina. I know we don't have much time, but when adultification, I love this question when it's like, how are we eliminating this? How are we mitigating the amount of adultification? And I think like just from like I think just from my experience and some of the studies I had is like that intersectional analysis of like looking at like these policies and practices and really just trying to see like, okay, if this is what the curriculum is, if you are saying like this person this calls for this action of this measurement, we have to see like what are the um, what grace is allowed, what grace has been leveraged, and really when you discuss grace, see, is it across the board? Is this grace across the board? And I'm going to tell you 9 times out of 10 it isn't. So when you are talking about like what practices can we have, it's providing that comprehensive training to like social workers and other professionals on the concept of adultification. So like looking at this impact on that it has on marginalized groups, let's strategize and see how are we addressing it effectively by being like by explaining how are we leveraging grace in childhood, like how are we leveraging how folks are making mistakes, or um how are we addressing these mistakes and how effective are they? Is it positive youth development? Like is it these things that we want to shoot for? And really trying to have like that kind of analysis and look at like what do we want to do versus what are we actually doing? I think like those kind of frameworks can help as well. Um and oh my god, I just want to like provide TA for this. I'm just like I just want to keep talking about this. But I know we're very, very close on time. So Kendall, if we have time for one more, but if not,
Yeah,
I
I think
totally.
we do have time for one more. If we don't get to your questions, please feel free to keep dropping them in the chat and we will reply to them via email to everyone. And if you're interested in TA for Martine, feel free to reach out to Youth Collaboratory and we'll get you set up on that, or with Regina.
It's a package deal.
Are some of these stats, so I think this one was particularly for Regina, but are some of these stats, particularly around the overrepresentation of Black girls, youth, and families in the child welfare system, available to us? They're really helpful. And that kind of went along with a couple of other comments around how do we take this conversation outside of this presentation?
Oh yeah. Yes, and the stats that we shared is in the presentation. They are cited. But I warn you, it will take you down a rabbit hole of other stats. And so there's just like Martine said, there's so much information, so little time. And I appreciate like the way that this topic has been embraced, and just the like the reciprocal learning that we've been doing, because y'all have been dropping y'all knowledge and things and resources in the chat. And as a follow-up email, we will be sharing some additional resources that are really good books that you can look into for yourself, for your staff, but then also some great reads for the youth and young adults that you work with, for just some continued learning and understanding for them too. So that's an important piece. But yeah, the statistics are available, and it really does speak to experiences. One of the things that Martine and I really wanted to be mindful of is is to to through representation, but like also understanding that these statistics are truly tied to stories, real lives, and bringing those real lives and stories to this space, so that it's so that it's separated, so that we're not separating statistics from actual real lives experiences and stories. Um, and so, yeah, I hope I answered that question.
Thank you both. So I've dropped the link to the chat a few times, but there's also a QR code here if you would like to complete that from your phone. Thank you so much for hanging in there with us. We know we kept you a little late. We really have enjoyed the interaction in the chat and your participation. We're really grateful for you all for being with us on this journey. And I know a few of you have said you'd be interested in additional workshops along these lines. Please share that in the chat. It's really helpful for us. And next slide, please. If you'd like to connect with Regina or Martine or Youth Collaboratory, here's some contact information. And we just really want to once again thank Regina and Martine for sharing their expertise and knowledge and just how powerful this presentation was. And we're very grateful for you all for being here with us today. Thank you.